Hello. This panel is about combat design and narrative in action games. We're all action game designers here on this panel, and this will give us an opportunity to discuss some of the thinking that went into the crafting of the systems and experiences. My name is Kevin Wong. I'm the producer on Death of a Wish, which is an action game that Colin can introduce later. But going around, can we get introductions about yourself and the elevator pitches for your game?
Sure, I can go. My name is Lily Valine. I was the creator of Bossgame, The Final Boss is My Heart. It's a lesbian romance boss rush about two girlfriends who fight devils to pay the rent. Um, it's out on Steam and phones and everything, I think. So,
Nice. I'll go. I'm Colin, he, they. I worked with Kev on Death of a Wish, which is a vicious action RPG where style is salvation, where you play as a kid who's fighting against the theocratic order that raised him in a nightmare dream world.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Sherveen. Pronouns are he, they. I'm the project lead of Midautumn. I wish I got like a little poster like Kevin did. That's so good. Uh, it's like a roguelike dungeon crawler with supernatural elements. I tell folks it has like a bit of Hades vibes mixed with like butterfly soup. It's about kind of reconnecting with your hometown and stopping it from undergoing gentrification, but also there's like ghosts and spirits and stuff that you have to fight. Um, in there, that's the game.
Great. And hi, I'm Marina. I am the co-creator with my friend Melos Hantani of the Anodyne series, and the game I'm mostly talking about today is Angeline Era, which is our forthcoming game. It's a bump combat action adventure game, which means that there's no attack button. You just run into enemies to attack them automatically. And there's a whole non-linear world to explore, and the story has influences from Irish, Christian, and Japanese American fantasy and lore, kind of.
Very cool. So the first section of our panel is going to be about pre-production and prototyping. What were the seeds of your game's design, and how did like systems and narrative ideas bounce off each other in early stages? Were there like any research or influences that were on your mind as you went into pre-production?
who should go first?
I could
Lily,
go if
you want
Lily,
to
if you want to
take
go,
the
you
lead?
can, but I
No,
can go.
you go, you go, you go.
Yep.
You're good.
Sure, I'll go. I think it was. I don't often get to like design games from like a thematic standpoint first because I do a lot of contract work. So that was like a big thing I wanted to do with Mid Autumn, and so it started a lot from just kind of character motivations, and it was a lot of like I grew up in the Asian diaspora and like apart from like a lot of my family a lot of the time. And I often think about like what that kind of awkward experience of like reconnecting with your community sometimes and not really being a subject matter expert on a lot of it. So I think it started from there, just a really strong character idea of like that experience. And I think we always knew we wanted to have some supernatural or fantastical elements, but we kind of had a very like carte blanche approach to the mechanics. We just tried a lot of different things at the start to just see what felt good, like gameplay wise, and also what felt good thematically. And I think we tried to err on the side of like something that felt good, really narratively. And we ended up with this combat system that's very, that's all about like reflecting things back at you, which I think has a lot of cool narrative implications in various ways. So you kind of pick up enemy projectiles and shoot them back at enemies. You were like, we can find a lot of cool narrative things to build off of that as a structure, and also I think it feels really fun. So I think that was the starting point for us.
I think jumping off of that, in some ways it sounds similar, but yeah, I think we definitely usually start with more mechanical ideas first, because sometimes it is hard if you start with kind of a story idea to come up with gameplay that doesn't feel like heavy-handed in service of that story. But from what I hear, you're kind of going back and forth a little with those things interacting with each other. So we went through like a lot of different early kind of tests or ideas, many of which we didn't really like work out into like full prototypes. But some of the funny ones were like we were gonna make like these a Frogger based action game where it was like on a grid and there was like ideas for having like a dating sim with the bosses. There was another idea where your character would have like a kind of a spherical head with sort of like pins pointing at like various like danger elements in a way that would kind of like visually symbolize like proprioception or like the sense that you have of like things being around you. But I think a lot of what ideas we were toying around with that ended up in the final thing were based around like just trying to, yeah, like abstract sort of spatial reasoning down to really simple components, and that's kind of like where we ended up with the bump combat. And then yeah, we had a lot of fun, interesting research for it, which I don't know, maybe it's a lot to go into. But yeah, Melis and I actually went on a vacation/research trip to Ireland together, which was really cool. And I'm using a lot of photos from that in the art.
Nice.
That's awesome.
Very cool.
I had a similar sort of approach, Marina, as what you were mentioning, at least with... So Death of a Wish is a follow-up to a previous game called Luca Born of a Dream. And that game kind of just started as like an arcadey roguelike, which is really weird to say. And then I found out that I was not interested at all at making something like that. But I had these like set of like action mechanics that I thought were fun. So as I was trying to like figure out what they could like morph into, I kind of like built the like theming and initial art style and like story stuff, both from like things in my own life, but then things I thought would gel with kind of like the friction and intensity of the combat that like everything derided from. So in a way, it was like the mechanical design inspired everything else, down to like the story and the theming, with then some back and forth, kind of like Shavine, what you were mentioning, especially as things start to mature. But then when we were starting on Death of a Wish, the follow-up, it was almost like the opposite happened, because we already had like a base to build off of, but what we needed was a really strong thematic point to kind of like guide everything else. And so I think that came from like, okay, like what is this character trying to accomplish? What are they like? And then how does that inform the action design of the game? And so we kind of came at it with both ways, and I think it kind of shows if you play both of the games. The one kind of started a little more mechanical, and one started a little more narratively.
That's funny. I feel like the going back and forth thing is definitely, like you said, it happens more and more as you go through development. I kind of went into Bossgame with a few different ideas. A big one was just that I wanted to make an RPG or like a big like story heavy game, because I've mostly done game jams before, but I wanted to make something that I would actually finish one day, so I only put the bosses in. And then I wanted to tell a story. I wanted to tell like a romance story that didn't like end on the first kiss, which is how most of our romance stories are framed. Because I really kind of wanted to explore the idea of like, well, okay, what are people like in a relationship? Because like most of the relationship is being in the relationship, so like, you know, I thought it would be more interesting to tell that kind of story and be something you didn't see as much. And then the other big challenge I kind of set for myself was I wanted to try and make a game that felt good to play on mobile. And I wanted to make an action game that felt good to play on mobile, which is very tricky and like not something a lot of people do. I think like a lot of action games are hard to do on mobile. Obviously, I think people have a uh, presumption that doing like accurate stuff is hard on phones. So I really wanted to put a lot of focus on seeing if I could make that work. Um, and so that kind of ended up boiling down into this idea of controlling two characters with two thumbs, um, which also tied in really well with these two characters who are dating each other. So it's all about using them in coordination to fight bosses. And that obviously that ended up tying in really well with like the themes of the game, the themes of like partnership and reliance on each other and trust. Uh, that I tried to work into the mechanics wherever I could, mostly because it was just fun. But yeah,
One thing you said that I want to highlight, even though it's not really the theme of this discussion, is just that making something that you know you can finish is a highly underrated but very valuable thing in game development. I certainly think that applies to all of us here because we've all shipped multiple games. So
yeah, it
Definitely.
was it was definitely something where I've tried to make RPGs and RPG Maker before or something like that, and just like it's hard to control the scope of those. It's hard to they can get very big very quickly. So
During your prototyping phases, I'm wondering, curious to know if there was like any particular moments where you knew some design clicked, when you had like alignment between your narrative and your mechanics.
I mean, I think a big one, Kev, when we were doing Death of a Wish, was just deciding to make it like a full-on character action style fighter game. Whereas like its previous game, Luca, was more soulsy. It had a stamina bar, all that stuff. We just like ripped that all out for this one, and then it immediately became a much angrier, more furious game, which is exactly what we were going for.
I think for us with Mid-Autumn, I remember doing the early playtesting because it was very atypical from a lot of things I've worked on. I think usually when I'm in pre-production, it's like reckoning with the thing I think I want to make versus what actually I want to make, or like what where the playtests are telling me. And we had this really weird thing where like the narrative I think was hitting really early on, and so that was working really well. And so it takes a lot longer for the actual mechanics to catch up. And it was a lot of like being very nervous because I'm like, people are being too positive, and that is like a problem sometimes because I don't know if it's like, oh, people really just like the premise or the potential of like the concept, and so they're being like kinder than they would be with a playtest. So I think it really was like having the first couple playtests that went really badly in an ironic way was like, okay, this is like giving me a better sense of the possibility space. And we made like a lot of tweaks. I think one tweak we made was early on there wasn't really a thing to do when you don't have ammo necessarily. Like you have to pick up. So the enemies were really driving the pace of the combat, which we initially thought would be a really like cool thing. But for some players, that's like way too frustrating. They're like just waiting for it, and I empathize with that. So we ended up doing something where you could kind of bank like damage, so that when you did pick up ammo, it like deals a bunch of damage at once. So it's almost like a setup move, so you can do it at any time. So that's like just giving players a button they can press when there's nothing going on, basically. And I think that really changed the flow of the combat, where you can be a lot more proactive and make more interesting choices. And then we were like, okay, let's find a really cool narrative conceit for this as well. And I think that's when it started to kind of the actual flow of how the gameplay works was a lot clearer once we figured that out.
Nice. I think for us, I'm remembering back, and one of the big early influences was the Super Nintendo game Wild Guns, which is kind of like an arcade shooter, kind of where you control the cursor and shoot at enemies. But we kind of wanted to like combine that with your also like moving around in this kind of top-down Zelda view. Um, and at first there was like you hold down the gun button, and then it changes your controls to moving the cursor around the screen. Um, but that was like really, it felt laborious um, in context with the like running around your character, because all of that is much simplified in Wild Guns. And so I think something clicked when we made it so that it just auto aims kind of up into the screen from you. And so whatever height the enemies are at, you just automatically start shooting them if you're lined up with them horizontally. And then that in combination with originally it wasn't bump combat, there was an attack button. And so just stripping away like extra controlling kind of whenever we could, so that all of it was just like about the position of your character on the screen, instead of kind of like thinking about the hitbox of your attack or thinking about where your cursor is for your gun. We just like put it all into just your position on screen, and so it starts to feel more and more simple, but also kind of densely layered with what's happening, and that's I think when it started to click.
I think it's funny that for this question we've already got an example of someone adding something and that made it click, and then people taking things away and that made it all work.
I love that, and I love this
Yeah,
style of
it's
like.
really
Oh,
cool when you
sorry, go
discover
ahead.
stuff like
Go ahead.
that.
I was just gonna say,
Go
Mary,
on.
I love the like feel of like abstracting something down to like really really simple components. And anytime like I could find a way to do that. Unfortunately, with Midautumn, it's like more of a maximalist design. So it's just like we're like, okay, let's add another thing, we'll add another thing here. But I really enjoy
Uh,
working on games like that do the opposite as well.
yeah. Going off of both of you, actually, I ended up having like originally I came up with like much more complex move sets to what you would do in boss game. Like boss game is pretty straightforward in that you can mostly just attack, and you have like a couple different kinds of blocks that are, or a couple different kinds of attacks that are pretty straightforward. I originally made it like much more complex and like kind of min-maxy in a way that like something like World of Warcraft might be, where you would try and combine attacks in really complex ways. Um, and that ended up being like way too much for the game ended up getting faster and faster, and so that kind of strategic like long-term thinking didn't really fit as much. And so in my case I actually ended up making the flow dictated way more by the enemies themselves rather than the player. um, because the player has a very simple attack, like a very simple set of inputs, and it's usually that each different boss that you fight like sets the tone and the pacing of the fight, which I think is one like interesting in a game. I guess it's focused mostly on bosses, but it certainly lets me put more personality into them rather than focusing on like different weapons or whatever. Yeah.
That's actually a good segue to our next set of questions, which is all about pacing across the experiences. Generally speaking, how do you think about pacing in your game, whether on like the moment-to-moment scale or in like the broader sense of the game's overall arc? And how do you, with your tools, how do you create intrigue and highs and lows of energy and so forth?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because I think that's something even veteran designers can struggle with. Um, but I think so. So thinking about um, our previous two games, Kev, like Luca, I mentioned before, was a little more like Soulsy, and I think that also showed in how like its different areas were constructed. Not in the like, oh, everything's interconnected way, but more in like it just kind of feels like a dungeon crawl, and there's like very sporadic moments of like an NPC you can talk to or like a cutscene or something. Um, so it ends up almost feeling like a little more monotonous if I want to frame it in a more negative way. Um, so I think something, especially when you're developing an action game with a focus on storytelling, like it's not just a pure like arcade experience or anything like that. Um, you really got to take into account like it's almost like songwriting. Like you got to have like the verses and the chorus and the ups and downs and all that stuff. And in a way, like your action is kind of like what, um, the intensity of the action can help facilitate that, and then those big highs can be like set pieces or like big story moment or even just a really cool boss fight or whatever. And the way you tune those is gonna depend on like how story heavy your game is or what kind of like narrative delivery you're doing. Like if you're doing the more like cinematic AAA style, then that stuff can be a little more um, I want to say like enmeshed. Like you're kind of moving in and out of the different modes pretty often, whereas I think lower budget, like smaller titles like ours usually need to kind of separate those a little more. Like Luca had a lot of like text interstitials and things like that to deliver story because we couldn't really do like giant cutscenes or whatever. Um, but again, it's all like it's like different ingredients or like pieces of a song that you can sequence together, and you got to think about like what the player's going through, and is like doing 10 combats in a row going to achieve the emotional feeling you want. It might, if it's supposed to be like a really like trying part of the story or whatever. Um, but it's all for you to play with as the designer, and it's all about emotional like paint strokes in a way.
It's really interesting. I was definitely gonna bring up musical metaphors. I think for pacing, it's a really good way of thinking about it. I think in terms of the like moment to moment action stuff, I think there's some stuff that I'll talk about for the next question. So I'm gonna answer from like some of the further out abstracted sense. I think there's like a different a feeling for this game than some of the previous games that I've worked on, which where the action was more kind of quiet in tone or more sort of like a little flavor kind of aspect, a little bit simpler in certain ways or puzzly in certain ways. Whereas for this game, it's definitely a more like kind of like all about the action when it is about the action, and so it has been an adjustment in terms of like the writing style, like where and how much you're like talking to NPCs or stuff like that. Um, it's really been like um, more separating that stuff out, I would say, and focusing on the action when it's happening. Um, and then outside of that, because there's all these levels that are pretty focused action levels, but we string them together with like an RPG style overworld. And there's a bunch of stuff that I'm pretty excited with about how the overworld works and the pacing. There's a mechanic that originally saw in the RPG Wild Arms 3, where you have to search for the areas that you're finding on the overworld map. They're not really, they're basically invisible, and you just are like, oh, I think something's probably here, or maybe I got directions to a place, and so I have to like press a button to search and see if it's actually here. And I really like that because it kind of feels like exploring a place in real life where like the first time you go to a new location, you have to kind of pay a lot of attention. But then as you get to know like a city or whatever, then it kind of becomes abstracted into like the simplicity of a map in your mind. And yeah, so that's kind of like that exploration feel is a big part of how we're spacing out the more intense, pure action parts.
Yeah, for boss game, I feel like for the moment to moment action, as far as the pacing, like within the course of like, for example, like a single fight, a big thing I tried to do was, I guess I've been thinking a lot about the concept of like tempo recently, and so in within the course of a fight, it's like pretty typical of like most bosses. Like the bosses will get a little more complex over time, and especially because this is a game without like regular enemies that you can kind of practice things on. Usually, a start of a fight will teach you like the basic of like how the boss operates. Like some bosses hide from you for a while or surprise you, or they trick you by pretending which side they're going to attack on, for example, and then as the boss goes on, they do more and more of that, or they amp it up, or whatever. And so like it's a pretty like straightforward tempo curve. But I think one thing I like that it is in addition to that is you have your own, you have like a super meter basically, and so you have the ability to stun the boss for like 6 or 7 seconds, which also changes the tempo of the fight in that like now rather than having to play mostly defensive and like sneaking in attacks when you can, you just have this free like small period of time where you can kind of just do whatever you want. And I think that also adds like kind of a fun back and forth because like then the boss breaks free and they start doing their own attacks back at you, so you have these ups and downs that happen throughout the fight, even as it's going mostly up, which I thought was a lot of fun. As far as like the larger scope, like meta pacing, I guess. Um, the biggest thing I can say I wanted to do with Boss Game was that I tried to like I basically followed a pretty straightforward formula of like having an introduction to a boss, having the boss fight, and then following with an outro. I don't know if outroduction is a word, but and having an outro. And what I wanted to do was really kind of amp up like the personality of each boss. I wanted to build up before you fought them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it adds a lot of fun, both because like there are bosses that cover the gamut from like screaming anime villains to like very cowardly to like people who really don't want to fight you to all sorts of different different like personalities and stuff. And so having a chance to really build up by having like your characters talk to each boss before they fight them, it really kind of adds a lot to it, I think. So having that was a lot of fun. And then I did what I could to add in. The one thing I had to do was add in a little bit of extra story after major moments where like you just had like a major boss fight. It tends to be like an act ender or something like that in part of the story, and I didn't want to go from that right to another boss fight, so I added more and more story at those parts to kind of give the player a chance to like cool down. And like there's like one part where there's actually like a coffee break, where you just kind of take it slow for a minute, and that was mostly just as a way to like kind of set the pace down again before building it back up.
Just real quick, there was one. Yeah, I was thinking about the parts in boss game where the boss is stunned, and so you can just kind of go wild on them. And going back to like the music metaphor, I think so. There's like a thing a lot of like Nintendo games do where you have to do like the contrived thing to get the boss's weak point open, and then that's like the only time you can attack them. Um, and I think it's almost like that's like a pop song that's like a little like too simple in my opinion, where it's exactly the chorus feel when it's the chorus, and then it goes back to exactly the verse feel when it's the verse, and it's always in the same kind of order. But when the way it works in boss game, it's like the stun is kind of like based on a lot of other stuff you can do, and you can choose how aggressive you want to be, even though like there's parts where you need to be more defensive overall. And so it's just like musically there's a lot more going on, even though you still get that like moment when you break them open and are kind of free, and that's fun.
I think that's a big reason why it's almost becoming a cliche now that a lot of these, you know, uh, combat games in the AAA space, and we're guilty of this too, does like a break, like guard break or posture break, like you fill up a meter and then you can go to town on the enemy because it's like inherently a like like doing that but a little more complex maybe, add a little more uh, back and forth to the shifting of the tempo in a individual fight.
Yeah, they're really satisfying. Oh, sorry.
Crescendo.
Yeah, I think it's really. Oh, I was just gonna say, I think it's really interesting that like everyone's mentioned music because I don't know if anyone does this. When I'm doing a lot of early pacing stuff, I will often just make like a quick like Spotify playlist or something, and just be listening to it as I'm like doing like basic gameplay to see if it feels about right. So because I think there's so many different ways to think about pacing, especially like we're making a roguelike, so there's like the like pacing of like one cycle versus 10 cycles versus like a specific biome and then the like so it's like we try to tackle that at different stages. But yeah, I think we would like go I shouldn't say we, this is just me probably. I can't apply it to the team. I would like make a playlist for like different biomes sometimes and be like thinking, okay, I want this biome to feel a bit more like
Oh no.
Oh no, shoot.
Oh no.
I
Happened to me while Sherveen was talking.
I
Oh my
got I got
gosh.
lost.
Ravine,
I
welcome
got
back.
lost.
You're back.
You're
You're
back.
back. Good.
Oh no. I was just saying if I'm playing it and it feels off, then I like tweak until it feels a bit right, and that's a thing that I use as a tool sometimes to help with that.
I love the idea of making a playlist to like set the different tones and stuff of your game. It's something I actually started doing for my next game too, where I was like, I need to like kind of be reminded of like what I want different parts to feel like, and I'll just find like a big collection of like 20 or 30 songs to like
Yeah.
get in the zone, I guess.
And once we have the actual music, like it gets a lot easier. I can just listen to the actual boss track and be like, oh yeah, this needs to like really like this moment has to go really hard here. And like if you have any dynamics and you can time it with something, that's really great. I think one thing I also wanted to mention that we did look a lot at was like we were trying to make like an action game for visual novel players was like the weird thing we challenged ourselves with. It's like, can we make someone who's really into visual novels get really into like combos and stuff and like builds? And so we really looked at like the average length of our dialogue. I think everyone kind of does this like subconsciously, but we were like, okay, like how much feels like too like slow paced, how much breaks up the combat a bit too much, and what feels like too short, and just finding a nice balance between like knowing players are going to want to read things and then also some players are going to skip through that, and then how to make that work in both contexts.
It's interesting how I feel like all of us are visual novel kind of influences for intense action games.
There's an extended Umineko reference in Death of a Wish.
Yeah.
That it's funny seeing people get to it and they're like, is this like Tsukihime or Umineko? What's going on here?
It's the one I jump to every time I watch a stream of the game.
Oh yeah, one thing that Shireen, the playlist thing made me think of. This is like a tangent, but it's something I forgot to mention in the pre-production part. I've been using this app called Eagle for the first time, which is like for sorting reference images, and I've never done something like that before. A lot of games in the past have been, the visual design was very kind of like whatever like weird dream things I'm pulling out of my head and kind of chaotic. And this one, there is a lot more like, okay, this is like based on certain concepts or whatever. And so that has been good for research. So I just want to put that out there.
I'm making a Eagle is what it's called. I should also.
Yeah.
We have so
Eagle,
many
right.
reference images. It's just like
Because
every
it's
day
so
I'm like,
hard to
let me make
sort
another
them.
reference image from this thing I saw, and then like organizing it is really hard.
Yeah, you can make all these folders that, contain the images multiple times in different folders without having like copies of them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I have like 10 copies of the same like image or GIF or something somewhere. Sure.
Moving on to the next set of questions. These questions are about emotion. In your games, how can action game systems convey different emotions like anger, love, humor, and wonder? And what kind of narrative beats or qualities would you convey with action mechanics versus more text or dialogue heavy sections, and why?
That one's funny for at least thinking about Death Wish, because it's a pretty just angry game, and I think that was the one emotion that at least the combat system was diving towards.
I think there's a lot of guilt too. I think you're selling yourself short.
Yeah, Luca was about like depression, and then Death Wish is like, all right, I'm tired of being depressed. Let's do something about the things that are making the world depressing. So I guess in that way, there's a little bit of like, I don't know if wonder's the right word, but like thinking about the world and how to affect change through a combat system, which hopefully it works. We'll see. But that does make me think, Shavine, that one thing that we did in this game, maybe against the better judgment coming from an audience that likes these like hardcore like 1v1 Dark Souls bosses, is that we added a lot of set pieces to the game where you fight alongside ally characters. And these people hate that, but there's like a good like story and thematic reason for it, especially because a lot of like the story of what's going on in Death of a Wish is like one person's like revenge journey kind of like running afoul, and like him realizing that he needs to be more than just a single person to actually like get anything done or to do anything good, essentially, which involves not forgetting about others who could kind of help you along your journey, but rather like bringing them into the fold, organizing, and then affecting action that way. I don't want to go on too much more before it sounds like I'm preaching, but
No, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
We ended up doing a really similar thing with some of the Midautumn boss fights. We have like a very a particular one against like a giant mech kaiju thing, and I was like, it would be really cool if one of our characters was like doing stuff in the boss fight, but like in a way that still gives you agency. So it's like some of the like phases or attacks are because of that character being involved, and then we also had things where it's like I wanted. Because it was like a narrative thing of like, oh, the characters are always talking about helping you out and doing this and that, but there wasn't at some point no basis in gameplay for that. So I was like, okay, what if, you have to, there are ways for the characters to appear in combat, or like you can summon them for like small moments, and we can like have some narrative moments where it's like you got to bring them somewhere and then do something, and I like that idea of. I always think with some certain games, like even like Souls-like games, it's like that lonely feeling is sometimes like unpleasant to me, and I like there to be some moments where it's like, hey, everyone showed up to help you out. So I think that's like, like a similar kind of motivation behind that decision.
And it can make for effective like climactic moments, like that kind of contrast. So it's all good.
Yeah, it feels like there's certainly like different emotions that are easier and harder to do within the context of like a fight, right? Like boss game kind of covers the gamut from like either like anger or jealousy are kind of obvious ones. There are some very cowardly bosses that I think I had a lot of fun putting together. And then there's like one I'm kind of proud of that's like a moment of like betrayal between characters within the boss fight. But like there are different moments that I actually considered trying to make into boss fights that didn't really work. There's like an I wouldn't say extremely, but like a more depressing scene, like a more self-guilt, self-hatred sort of scene that like there's very little way to make it into a boss fight. I guess I probably could if I thought about it, but I don't know. I tried to like do a lot of different, or like cover a lot of different emotions through boss fights, but for scenes that were either slower or a little more thoughtful or a little more quiet, I guess, like I would step away and let text do the work. I don't know, but
one thing that I was thinking about when I was writing that question was just like the fundamental system of boss game where you're healing each other, and that being kind of like experience that emotion of like caring and loving in a relationship, and Yeah, and that's definitely, I think, maybe one of the rarer ones to explore in the combat action game.
That
Uh,
was that was definitely the one the moment where I realized like so basically in boss game the two characters can revive each other and as long as one of them is up they can always pick up the other one and it's very blatantly shown as like them shooting hearts at each other basically. Um, and that was one of those moments where like when I put that in the game and I was like oh okay no this is like would not have made sense for this game to not have it basically because it's one of those things that really shows I don't it feels like a very good abstraction of like how you would imagine like a cool fight scene or like even if you imagine something where like if you imagine a fight scene where two characters are working together and they finally like overwhelm a boss like being able to do that in boss game with like the stun gauge too is like it feels less like personal power and more like both of my characters are actually teaming up and like working together because they're perfectly coordinated in a way, even though it's just you. Um, I don't know, so I was pretty happy with those.
Yeah, Lily, that made me think of so the idea of like, oh, this is something you would imagine happening in a cool fight, and I think that like gets into how I think about emotions in games. Is I think like you're right. There's like totally easier things. I think like simpler emotions are easier, like anger and things like that are easier to do, especially in combat. And it is very hard to do like more nuanced or complex emotions, especially like I struggle with things that involve like coming from a place of like a lack of agency because oftentimes that's very like it bumps players in a way that's like hard to design for sometimes. But I think a big approach we have is like this idea that the game you're playing isn't really like the pixels on the screen. It's like in your head. It's like your perception of the game. So we have a very like simple, like kind of lo-fi pixel art style in Midautumn, and one of the reasons, besides production, it's cheaper to do, but also one of the reasons we did it is because I really like that era where not everything in the art style is like 100% photoreal, so you kind of have to imagine things a bit more and to get players in that mindset of like, oh, here's what's actually happening in my head. And one of the things we did was we have these really like more detailed, like really pretty character portraits, and we have like a really animated big intro cutscene and things like that. But it's the idea of getting players into the mindset of like the stuff that's happening is like more dramatized than what you're seeing on screen, and then they just start picturing that and getting in that habit. And I think that helps you do like, you know, like you can have a character move like 1 pixel, but like someone's picturing them like stepping back like dramatically or something like that. And that's, I think, a thing we did to make our job a bit easier in kind of designing those moments without having to like spend a ton on like cutscenes and music and, you know, everything. Uh,
Yeah, I think things like that like can really get a lot of emotion across because I do think in more abstract styles, certainly like something like having a even a still sprite like move back a little bit makes it really obvious that like oh like they can see people can see what's happening there in their head and like you said it's much easier to do. The closer you get to high fidelity, like making that look good is can be very hard.
One
yeah.
last thing that I think is kind of interesting, Shervin, you mentioned agency, and that made me think that in both Boss Game and Maria and I kind of think about this in Anodyne 2 with, I'll just say, the gargoyle section, where you kind of remove things that the player is able to do normally, can be like a really powerful way to just change the emotional tenor of what's going on. Um, like I think about the part in Boss Game where you're only controlling one character, whereas before you're controlling two. Like that immediately changes both like how mechanically everything works, but then also like what you're feeling in those moments. Um, and yeah, it can be especially powerful if you're struggling with like fighting three dudes only feels a certain way. Well, it's like, well, think about maybe what can you take away from the player to induce a different emotional tenor to the scene. And I gotta say, I think I kind of ripped off that gargoyle segment in a certain part of Death of a Wish, so it's very effective, if not influential.
Um, yeah, for this question, the emotion I think that we've been thinking about a lot in Angeline Era is kind of like just like I don't know, wonder, I guess, in and kind of like a humorous aspect a lot of the time of wonder or just like unexpected or odd things happening. And I think like one thing that we've been thinking about a lot or is sort of like going back to the musical metaphor. It's like it can be easy to think about action design like only from a sort of like I don't know, kind of like difficulty or intensity or like learning perspective, where it's like, okay, so I'm like building up a certain amount and then I'll create a little quiet spot so that this intense spot will hit. Uh, and if you like follow the rules too much, it gets to a point where someone who's like played a bunch of games is like, just knows what's going to happen kind of by how you do it. They know kind of it can happen with level design too, where you're like, oh, it's this little side path. Depending on how long it is, it might be like a better or worse item, or like how much trouble it is to get to. I kind of know I'm going to get something good out of this chest or whatever. Um, and so we're trying to like really break a lot of those rules. Something Mello said recently, which was funny, was like doing level design, he kind of like makes a level that's like just like a good level, and then afterwards he figures out some way to make it worse. um,
I like that.
Oh,
and it's really great. It's funny to go down this whole path, and at the end of it is this like room full of spiders, and you defeat all the spiders, and then you open the chest and it's just full of tiny spiders.
uh,
So there's a lot of stuff like that where we're trying to kind of just like not follow the kind of musical rules.
those parts always end up being like the memorable parts too, right?
Mhm.
Like that's how you, if you're following like a very standard path, it's hard to draw more emotion out of that because people are already expecting what you're giving them. I think when designers do something that they think is funny personally, or like they put something in because they're like, this would be really funny for me, or like this would be fun to just mix it up or whatever. Those parts always often end up being like very memorable, or even like kind of like a watermark of the people who are making it, I think.
So this is a thing that we do sometimes. Um, I think we've talked about this like with our narrative lead CC. We were talking about the writing as well. It's this idea of like, okay, what are the complaints about this game going to be? Because I think sometimes people try to like design around like making sure everyone's having like the best time possible with the game. But I think sometimes like I think about like the water temple in Legend of Zelda or something. Sometimes it's like really cool to have a part of your game that everyone's like, I don't like this part, but it like sometimes like makes the whole experience feel more complete sometimes. So sometimes we do this exercise of like, okay, what is the complaint, and we try to design for it, because I think if there's intentionality behind it, if you're like, if you shoot your shot and you're like, people are going to not like this part, but they're going to like this part, and then everyone kind of maps to that. I think that's a really good sense of like you understanding your player base. And then it's really fun to also meet like the weirdos who are like, no, actually that's my favorite part of the game, because and that's also fun to create a space for that. Like just like the people who are like, actually the water temple's good, or it's my favorite part. It's my favorite part in Zelda. I think it's good to
Yeah.
have like both those types of people in your community.
You need something for the sickos. Poison swamp,
Exactly.
whatever.
Yeah. I mean, everyone talks about the water temple. Like that's the temple that people talk about in The Legend of Zelda. So like,
We only have a few minutes left, but the last few questions are about production. What were some interesting problems that you had to solve to create this game, and areas where like constraints could have bred creativity?
I've got a really easy one. If you look at our scene page, you might notice that we didn't color in all the pixels. um, and that's not a mistake. Um, our game does have a distinct high contrast art style, and it's part of the reason that we could have like 8,000 frames of animation in an indie game, which makes the action work. So, you know, I don't know if we'll do it again, but the game kind of wouldn't exist in the way that it does if it had a different style, both from like a production standpoint a feasibility standpoint, and the way something looks definitely impacts how it feels when you play it. Um, so yeah, it's kind of like the easiest example of like limitations-free creativity, right?
I remember distinctly, Colin, like as someone who does, I do like all the enemy pixel art for games, and we have to do all of it. And I remember the first time I saw like the Luca original thing, and I was like, "It's brilliant! It's such a good idea
Yeah.
to do outlines." And
It
then
doesn't work for everyone, but at least it helped get the game shipped.
Yeah.
no, I think it looks really cool. I think it's like such a distinct look. And I think it's very hard to do with pixel art to make something that doesn't like that looks good, but in a way that's specific. Is very hard sometimes. But
That was certainly my experience with Boss Game too. Was the reason it ended up 90% black and white was simply that was what I was capable of doing. I actually ended up having I got invited to do like a local convention that we have that I was going to run a booth at, and I was still using like placeholder. I had like a bunch of Zelda sprites in there that I was using for bosses and stuff, and I was like, okay, I have a month to put actual art in this game, and then I'll hire an artist, and then I'll like find someone to work with or something, and then it just never happened. So I just stuck with the art, like the black and white pixel art stuck there the whole time, and it worked well enough, and it was in my wheelhouse at least. So
I'm almost a little embarrassed bringing this topic up, considering we have a beautiful painterly artist with Marina here. Like some of those screens and even the ocean could be like in a museum. So I'm curious how it feels coming from that perspective.
Oh, I mean, uh, there, there's so much that you got to do to simplify the art process. I feel like, especially with, yeah, I don't know. I think a big thing that we've been thinking about, which I'm surprised I haven't mentioned yet, but there's this concept that we've been going with in the design where, as a kind of contrast to like the action set piece, which requires a lot of like unique art assets or different things and unique animations in like a AAA game. Uh, we have this concept of the set poem, which is it's really about kind of communicating something, and what is being communicated is kind of abstract a lot of the time, but it's like it's about using the base elements, kind of like, I don't know, Legos or some very like simple building blocks, and then just arranging them in a certain way where it feels like a little story is being told in this screen with how the enemies are standing around, or with some maybe like the trees are placed in an unexpected way or different things like that. And so we're trying to make it so that, yeah, like every little screen is like a little poem kind of, and they're all based on these very like grid simple kind of pieces.
I think like for us, I think a big thing that defined our production was like a lot of the team is part time. Like we all have day jobs, and we're kind of just working towards it. And I'm a lot about like I think about it almost like min maxing. It's like I want to make other things as simple as possible so that we can pick a few areas to really go all out in and like and try and punch above our weight basically. And the way I approached it, I think with everyone like that we collaborated with it, we like some really amazing character portraits for our portrait artist Mai, and like Kiana is one of our pixel artists, does like a lot of our like really great environment art. And I was like, whatever happens, I am going to be like the junior artist, junior writer person. So that is like the floor, is like it has to work in a way that it's still cohesive with me making not as good versions of your things. And so I think that's like that was a really interesting thing when we were doing like a lot of the visual development, is that they were figuring out styles that like they're like Trevine could reasonably do this if he had to. And so I think that was a really good way to constrain everything to make it a lot more manageable. Because I think what the actual assets are things that the team can do in like just what's within their comfort level, and then there's like lower priority things where I'm like, okay, I'm try and step it up and try and get something good in for this section that doesn't look bad. But I think yeah, I think like especially with the portraits, we're like, let's go really really hard on those and like make them look as good as we possibly can, so that some of the other things can kind of support a lot of the other parts, because it's a very character driven game. And also like going back to the visual novel inspiration, it's like, what are people going to care about more? And it was like, let's make the characters feel really fleshed out and fully realized, and everything else will kind of support that, as opposed to being the like centerpiece of the game.
Yeah, Shervine, I think that's a really good way of putting it, about like yeah, kind of the character creator like stat points, kind of, you're really like trying to max certain ones out, and I think that's such a great energy, and that's where like style comes from. That's like what makes it really like unique and special to like play a certain kind of game versus another kind of game. And there's definitely like yeah, like I have, you know, like taken like studied art and stuff like that from like a more traditional perspective, and so like there's a lot that I bring to from that. But definitely there's things that like I always kind of like skimp on, like I don't know, animation. I feel like is like tiring, and the honestly some of the things that I think you and Lily do well of kind of like big like fun impact kind of animation type stuff is like stuff that like does not come naturally to me at all. And so that's why a lot of our games have had sort of like a mellow like kind of quality to the action, and I'm trying to learn a bit more for this one because it is more actiony. But yeah, I love the quality that I'm always trying to describe, but I don't have the best words for it. But it's like when someone, despite like not the thing not looking immediately like perfect or fancy or whatever, and yet I feel that the creator is mad with power. That's the phrase that always comes into my head when I see something that I like. It's like it's because they're mad with power, even though like it's not just like power that is given to them automatically by having lots of money or something, you know.
That's
No,
something
I
that
think
worked for.
the way I perceive that is like, it's when you're like, we don't have the budget for this, but we're gonna do it, and we're gonna find a way to do it. And I think you can always tell when someone's like, we pushed a little bit to get this thing in here, and it shouldn't really be in here, but we figured a way to do it. And it always like, I feel like you can always tell when you're playing like someone else's games, like that they've like stretched something or broke something to put something in there, and it's always really fun.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for this panel. But to wrap up, can we share with folks where can we all find y'all online?
Sure. I am. It's me, Lily V. Basically everywhere online. I still technically use Twitter sometimes. I'm on co-host a lot. I do have a Tumblr that I use sometimes. But I'm working on a bunch of different games right now. I made Bossgame, The Final Boss is My Heart. I'm working on a game right now called Bright Red Song of Love. And I'm working on more games about relationships in the future. So please check them out. They're all relationships and action and stuff like that. So, yeah.
You can find me, my website is marinakitaka.com. And then I'm at even_KEI on Twitter. Oh, and wishlist Angeline Era.
Definitely. You can follow me at me less than 3 on whatever social media site you're on. And buy Death of a Wish now. There's a free demo if you're not convinced. It's on Steam, Itch, and Nintendo Switch.
Thank you all very much.
And thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.